我博伟君已经通过之前2期精读的内容，讲述了《心灵杀手》故事发生前的全部背景和事件。今天这期咱们讲起《心灵杀手》主线的故事。阿伦·维克遇见妻子爱丽丝是在他刚成为作家，与夜泉节目组结束合作之后。爱丽丝身为摄影师，与阿兰可谓相辅相成。她亲自为阿兰设计了多本小说的封面。两人曾在纽约的一所公寓中生活。爱丽丝患有黑暗恐惧症，这是种罕见的病症。每当陷入黑暗的时候，爱丽丝便会短暂地失去对周边的感知。话说有一次，公寓中意外地停电了。为了消除妻子的恐惧，阿伦·维克为他讲述了一个自己童年时的故事。他曾经也害怕黑暗，于是他的母亲当时给了他一个坏掉的神奇开关，并叮嘱他，每当面对黑暗产生恐惧的时候，只要把这神奇开关握在手里，心中就会充满光明的力量。2008年，当阿伦·维克的作品《亚历克斯·凯西》系列小说出到第6本的时候，他突然陷入了创作困境，仿佛昔日还是法宝的打字机和纸张一下就变成了会吃掉自己的怪物。整整2年，阿兰无法静下心来写作，长期被噩梦困扰，且情绪时常失控。妻子爱丽丝一直都在尝试帮助阿兰解决困境，直到她注意到了远在西北边陲的华盛顿州小镇亮铺镇。一位当地颇具名气的治疗学家埃米尔·哈特曼博士撰写了新书《创作者的困境》，恰好是应对艺术家创作困境的内容。于是爱丽丝私下和哈特曼博士取得了联系，双方约定2010年9月初在亮铺镇会面。2010年9月1日凌晨，阿伦·维克驾车与妻子驶入了亮铺镇界内，发现不远处被警车封锁。就在他询问警员何故时，对方回应只是一个交通意外。阿伦并不知道的是，仅仅在1周之前，自由撰稿人杰克·费舍尔抵达了小镇，且于1天之前的此处被黑暗力量彻底吞噬。驶入亮铺镇之后，妻子爱丽丝·维克为了让阿兰放松，自己代替他驾驶，而阿兰本人则疲惫地睡着了。他再次陷入了一场噩梦，梦中他独自驾驶着车子，头脑混乱不堪，只知道自己要前往灯塔。刚刚驶出隧道的时候，竟一不小心撞飞了一个拦车的人。阿伦·维克整个人都懵逼了。当他反应过来并下车查看的时候，发现那人竟然已经死了。意识到大事不好的阿兰还来不及后悔，只见车灯突然熄灭了，且那个死人竟然不见了。阿兰感到不可思议，他弃车前往灯塔，在路上竟看到自己信息的失踪通告。就在他准备走下台阶的时候，突然发现远处那个死人竟然站了起来。一眨眼的功夫，他就出现在了自己面前。只见他手中拿着斧子，全身冒着黑烟。他以小说中角色的口吻讽刺着阿兰本人，并一路展开破坏。阿兰本人也为走廊的塌陷而重重的跌落，只听那人依然在谩骂，讥讽阿兰写作水平奇烂，而自己作为其中的角色想要报复他。这时阿兰才想起，此人貌似是自己一篇小说中的人物，只不过现在他活了过来。阿兰没有武器，只得拼命逃窜，所经之处街灯全部爆炸毁坏。那人身后似乎有一股黑暗的力量，破坏力离谱。很快阿兰逃到了一座吊桥前，峡谷另一头，一个穿着学生制服的人正在呼唤他过去。阿兰跑过了吊桥，那人竟然认得阿兰本人。他号称自己名叫克莱斯特尔特。这个人和阿兰在不同的地方做了同一个梦，但阿兰本人并不认识这个人。总之，克莱斯特尔特让阿兰先躲进了屋子。
Oh no! Stop! No! Damn it, die! No! No! No!
眼看克莱斯特尔特被黑暗傀儡杀死，阿兰躲在光亮的木屋中不知所措。电视机中出现了可怕的图像，似乎是已经被折磨疯的自己。只听电视里不断地传出诅咒他的声音。不久后，一阵剧烈的震动毁掉了木屋，阿兰身受重伤，但他没想到一股刺眼的光芒包围了他。那光中有个声音正在召唤他： 只听那声音告诉阿兰，亮铺镇的巨斧湖是极其危险的，黑暗力量已经在小镇中蔓延，只有时刻待在光中才能保证安全。这股光明的力量正来自于1970年坠入湖底异空间中的诗人托马斯·赞恩。当托马斯的意识感知到自己当年作品中的主角阿兰·维克真正抵达亮铺镇之后，便进入了他的梦中，告知他危险将至。此时阿兰并不知道托马斯·赞恩是谁。这期间，托马斯将黑暗的秘密告知了阿兰。这些被黑色烟雾包裹的敌人，全部都是被黑暗力量吞噬、操纵，亦或是被艺术家创造出来的。消灭他们的唯一办法，只有使用强力的光芒烧掉他们身上的黑暗保护罩，并且立刻用武器击杀。托马斯·赞恩创造出了手电筒和手枪，交给了阿兰·维克。就这样，阿兰躲过了重重的堵截。即将抵达灯塔的时候，黑暗力量操控着龙卷风向他袭来。阿兰一口气跑进了灯塔内部，本以为将会得到光明的庇护，但没想到黑暗力量却早已等候在此。不知何时，阿兰从梦中惊醒，只见妻子爱丽丝坐在一旁，告诉他已经到了。此时，一艘渡轮搭载着两人驶向小镇的中心，周边的风景美得惊人，小镇1年1度的驯鹿节即将来临。阿兰欣赏着风景，爱丽丝则为他拍着照。此时的船上还有其他2个人，其中一个名叫本莫特，来自于巨斧湖山庄。渡船的尽头，小镇著名的电台主持人帕特缅因站在那儿，他一眼就认出了阿兰·维克，想要邀请他去自己的夜间节目做嘉宾。但阿兰此行只想和妻子爱丽丝在此放松，于是婉拒了缅因。此时，阿兰的电话响了，接听后得知是经纪人及老朋友巴里·惠勒打来的。巴里是阿兰青年时代就认识的好朋友，2个人的关系非常要好。只不过巴里和阿兰的妻子爱丽丝有些许矛盾。巴里已经提前帮维克夫妇租下了一间豪华的木屋，木屋的钥匙被一个名叫卡尔斯塔基的加油站老板保管着。双方约定在小镇的欧蒂尔餐厅见面。
I'll go fill her up while you get the key. I'll pick you up here in say 15 minutes.
Sure.
Alan, thank you for coming here with me.
I love you too. Go on. I'll promise to behave.
阿兰走进了餐厅，发现自己的宣传板竟然立在门边，不禁神经紧绷。
Welcome to the Oh Dear Diner.
Hi, I was wondering if you could help me. I'm looking for...
Mr. Wake. Alan Wake. Oh, God. I am your biggest fan. I know people say that all the time, but I really am.
I'm glad to hear that.
Rose.
Rose, I'm looking for Mr. Stuckey. Carl Stuckey?
Carl? Oh, of course, Mr. Wake. He must have gone to visit the restroom. He'll be back in a moment.
餐厅女招待罗斯·玛丽高尔德是阿兰·维克的忠实粉丝，她对于阿兰本人崇拜不已，一时间目光锁定了他。一旁正在喝咖啡的是国家公园的管理员拉斯基。
Rusty here is no longer human.
不远处坐着已经疯癫的安德森兄弟，2个人自从1976、1978年2次黑暗侵袭事件之后，已经接近于精神失常。阿兰正准备去洗手间寻找卡尔斯大基，这时他发现一位老阿姨正端着一盏灯，躲在走廊的入口，嘴中不断地念叨着黑暗中有危险，但阿兰并没有当回事儿。
Mr. Stuckey?
Carl couldn't make it. Unfortunately, he was taken ill. But I have the key for you and instructions on how to get to the lake.
Okay.
I wish you a good stay in my cabin. I'll come by later to check how you've settled in. And to meet your wife. I insist.
Thanks.
只见那穿着丧服的老妇人口中不断念叨着什么，她似乎也早就知道了阿兰·维克。阿兰本人并不知道，这就是黑暗力量的化身芭芭拉·贾格尔。他自己也完全没有想到，刚刚接过的并不是巴里为自己预定木屋的钥匙，而是巨斧湖中心已经消失了近40年的鸟爪木屋的钥匙。阿兰与罗斯和拉斯基寒暄几句，只见罗斯依然含情脉脉。阿兰立刻离开了餐厅，回到了车中，与爱丽丝一同前往芭芭拉·贾格尔指示他去的地方。这时，刚刚上完厕所的卡尔斯大基冲了出来，拿着本来要交给阿兰的钥匙，脑海中混沌不已。此时，黑暗力量已经接近于控制了他。下午，阿兰和爱丽丝抵达了巨斧湖边，只见一座吊桥通向湖中心的潜水员小岛。 他和爱丽丝沉醉于周边的美景，不禁想要立刻登上小岛。阿兰发现岛上的树桩上被刻上了2个人的名字，似乎是一对恋人。随后，他先一步进入了木屋。由于爱丽丝惧怕黑暗，房间中又没有电力，阿兰只得自己去开启发电机。此时，附近的鞋盒中的毒物引起了他的注意。阿兰从未听说过托马斯·赞恩这个名字。很快，他在电力室中恢复了木屋的电力。不知不觉，天色渐晚。爱丽丝呼唤着阿兰，号称想要给他一个惊喜。阿兰走进了卧室，听爱丽丝说惊喜就在对面的书房中。他好奇地推开了门，发现一台黑压压打字机放在桌子上，心中顿时五味杂陈。
What is this?
I guess I have a small confession to make. I thought maybe you could write here that a change of scenery would get you past.
Damn it, Alice! Everyone.
Hey! Just hear me out. There's a local doctor, Dr. Hartman. I read a book of his. He has a private clinic here. He specializes in helping artists. Maybe...
So now you want to get me committed?
No, it's not like that. That's not... Alan?
Just don't! I don't want to hear it. God damn it, Alice!
阿兰和爱丽丝争吵后，气得跑到了吊桥边，想要独自冷静片刻。但没有想到，木屋中竟然传来了爱丽丝的尖叫声，仿佛有什么野兽闯进去了一样。阿兰发觉不对劲儿，立刻往回跑。当他进入木屋后，只见爱丽丝不知何故坠入了巨腐湖中。阿兰焦急万分，想都不想，随即也纵身一跃，坠入了湖中。那冰冷又黝黑的湖水中竟然什么也没有，爱丽丝仿佛被什么东西吞噬了。阿兰维克失落地从湖中挣脱，回到了码头上，他沮丧不已，为妻子的意外感到自责。这时，那个中午在餐厅中遇到的丧夫老妇人再次出现，她告诉阿兰维克，爱丽丝已经死了，但是有一种办法可以救活她。巨腐湖拥有一种奇特的力量，可以通过创作在附近一定范围内改变现实。他暗示阿兰可以通过撰写小说手稿将爱丽丝复活，但前提必须由黑暗力量协助完成。阿兰此时已经意识混乱，冥冥之中被黑暗力量蛊惑，同意了这个可怕的要求。
Yes. All right. I'll fix it. I'll bring her back.
那之后，阿兰在失去了一半意识的情况下，被黑暗力量影响，开始撰写名为《启程》的手稿。这期间，黑暗力量借助手稿进一步侵入了亮铺镇的现实中。阿兰维克刚开始并不清醒，写作进展极慢，直到陷入了黑暗领域的第6天时，他意识到自己正在落入黑暗的圈套。为了拯救妻子并挽救接近失控的局面，他趁黑暗力量不曾注意之时，偷偷将曾经的诗人托马斯·赞恩也写进了手稿中，并书写了他和当地美女芭芭拉·贾格尔在1970年引发的悲剧，从而庄周梦蝶一样将现实的逻辑补充完整，并设计了潜水员形态的托马斯·赞恩拯救自己的桥段。终于在第7天的时候，身穿吉姆·盖瑞特型号潜水服的托马斯·赞恩出现了，利用光明的力量将阿兰·维克从黑暗领域中拉出，并将阿兰尚未写完的手稿全部送回了现实中，散落在小镇的各处。9月8日夜晚，阿兰·维克从巨腐湖岸边挣扎着爬出，距离他来到亮铺镇已经过去了1周。迷糊的他在路边找到了汽车，并驾驶它离去。途中，阿兰的意识开始模糊，失去控制的汽车随即撞毁了隔离栏，冲出了公路。当阿兰再次醒来的时候，他全身已经多处受伤。此时的他已经完全忘记了过去1周在黑暗领域中书写手稿的经历。此时的亮铺镇，因为他那部名为《启程》的手稿已经被黑暗力量大幅入侵，就算在白天也不一定安全。一些活着的人阴差阳错地履行起了手稿中的情节。阿兰在比尔特莫尔伐木营地附近逃离的时候，发现了一张自己写下的手稿，却记不清楚相关的内容。途中，他隐约看到了鬼魅一般的黑影。就在来到营地之后，他发现了一个男人，此人正是卡尔斯大基。
Carl Stucky, pleased to meet you, fair and square.
话说，卡尔已经成了黑暗傀儡， 如猴一样飞窜于木材之上，并一路追杀阿兰。在躲进木屋之后，阿兰找到了手枪和弹药，就在准备打电话求助的时候，突然发现外边传来了奇怪的响声。只见黑暗力量竟然控制了一架铲车向木屋袭来，很快整个屋子都被铲车推走了，眼看就要坠落悬崖。阿兰及时的逃了出去，一路上不断的被黑暗傀儡追杀，他凭借核能手电筒勉强的保护自己。期间，妻子爱丽丝坠湖的场景不断在脑海中闪现。这附近的黑暗傀儡大多数都是比尔特莫尔伐木营地的工人。阿兰意识到自己必须立刻抵达公路附近寻找电话。远处的斯大基加油站成为了他新的目标，而加油站的主人卡尔斯大基则一路追杀阿兰，如疾风一样飞驰于周边，即使被烧掉了黑暗外衣，也依然扛住了手枪。终于，阿兰抵达了加油站，并在零售区找到了电话，他立刻报警求助。不久之后，女警长莎拉·布雷克驱车赶来。阿兰无法说清自己的遭遇，但当他得知加油站的主人就是刚刚被自己杀掉的卡尔斯大基时，不得不隐瞒了部分事实。就在阿兰把部分经历告诉莎拉之后，对方吃惊地表示，巨斧湖中心的小岛早就不存在了。阿兰执意要回到巨斧湖边证明自己的经历，但来到湖边的时候，面前的场景让他震惊不已。就在阿兰遭遇意外的前夕， FBI 前探员罗伯特·南丁格尔也赶到了小镇。他曾与自己的一个搭档被称为正义兄弟，在调查杰克·费舍尔失踪案的时候抵达了亮铺镇，不曾想搭档却被黑暗力量吞噬，因此南丁格尔探员开始对黑暗力量有了认知，并且开始疯狂地调查引发这一切的人。9月9日上午，阿兰·维克在警局中接受了护理医生尼尔森的简单治疗。阿兰意识到这些人一定不会相信自己所经历的事情，于是谎称自己只是因为地形生疏遭遇到了交通事故。从广播中，阿兰得知小镇最近2天发生了不少意外事件。阿兰注意到那位1周前曾在餐厅中偶遇的韦弗阿姨再次出现了，她依然在摆弄着电灯开关，和双峰第1季试播集中木头女士的举动如出一辙。此时，警长助理格兰特告诉阿兰，莎拉警长准备和他谈话。在走廊中，阿兰发现了一堆小镇失踪人员的信息。很快，他来到了办公室。
Your phone's on the desk.
How did you end up at Stuckey's gas station?
突然，一个电话响起。
Hello?
Alice, please help me.
Alice?
对面一个男人的声音告诉阿兰，爱丽丝在他的手上。想要换回爱丽丝，今晚必须赶到恋人峰，亲自谈判条件，并且不可以通知警方。为了证明对方号称在警局后院留了爱丽丝的物品，维克立刻前往。途中，囚犯斯奈德正在大声地抱怨自己需要光明。很快，阿兰·维克在后院的废车中发现了爱丽丝的驾照，他只得暂时相信绑匪说的话。回到警局时，阿兰发现哈特曼博士出现了，顿时把怒火聚集在了他身上。
I'm Dr. Emil Hartman. I'd like to invite you to stay at Cauldron Lake Lodge.
Did you talk to my wife?
I had the pleasure of discussing your situation with her on several occasions.
Did you set something up with her?
I invited her here. My clinic is a place where...
Oh, hey! Oh my! Take it easy.
此时，阿兰的好友巴里·惠勒赶了过来。
Hey, nobody move! Get your hands off of my client.
Who are you?
I'm Barry Wheeler, his agent. If you have business with Mr. Wake, you talk to me. You yokels won't know what hit you once I sick my lawyers on your asses.
No harm done, Sarah. I'm all right. I don't want to press charges. Mr. Wake, my offer still stands.
Get me out of here.
What the hell was that about, Al? We don't need a replay of that thing with the paparazzi. I thought they were gonna lock you up.
恋人峰就在埃尔德伍德国家公园的最高处。阿兰和巴里在下午抵达了公园的游客中心。
I don't like it, Al. I don't like any of it. It's not good. In fact, it's the absolute opposite of good.
Mr. Wake! Barry, you found him.
Hi, Rose.
Oh, wow. I was just thinking about you, too.
Great.
I was just bringing Rusty some coffee. He's on the balcony, looking after Max. Poor thing. I really need to go. Great to see you again, Mr. Wake. Later!
Who's Max?
巴里对于阿兰诉说的经历感到不可思议，他 他认为阿兰肯定是混淆了创作和现实。很快，阿兰找到公园的管理员拉斯基，此时他正在给一条狗子疗伤，据称他不小心踩到对抗偷猎者的捕兽夹。阿兰帮了拉斯基一些忙之后，对方给了阿兰一把附近木屋的钥匙，于是阿兰和巴里今晚暂时居住在游客中心附近。夜色降临，巴里依然认为阿兰不应该相信绑匪的话，但阿兰只予以赴约。
Okay, then. I understand. You're my best friend, and I'm worried that you're not right in the head. Tell me what to do to help, and I'll do it.
You stay here, and if I'm not back by morning, call the cavalry.
很快，阿兰便顺着通道前往恋人峰。残念再次闪回，在接近游客中心的地方，阿兰听到了枪声和惨叫声。只见游客中心已经被黑暗力量破坏殆尽，而拉斯基身负重伤倒在地上。
Mr. Wake? Oh, hell. It happened just the way it was on that page. I found came true. It knew. So dark. It'll come back for me. You must... The lights. In the office. I have the key.
Okay, Rusty. Hang on. I'll be right back.
阿兰准备去对面重启店里，却发现已经被黑暗力量先行一步破坏。当他再次来到外边时，黑暗力量完全毁掉了游客中心，甚至拉斯蒂本人也成为了黑暗傀儡。那之后，阿兰继续向恋人峰前进，途中进入了曾经在禁酒令时期储藏私酒的月光洞穴。在乘坐缆车的时候，被一群黑暗力量控制的乌鸦袭击，眼看即将被傀儡杀害，但此时一个人突然出现了。
Come on, we gotta get moving. More of them coming. That flashlight's kid stuff. The flares won't keep the bastards away.
此人名叫本莫特，阿兰猜到此人就是绑匪，且他也发现自己1周前在乘坐渡轮的时候，这个人也在船上，只是自己不曾留意。本莫特让阿兰跟随自己前往谈判地。不久之后，他要阿兰帮助自己抵抗傀儡，以便开启大门。两个人在爬到观景台之前，与黑暗傀儡再次展开了大战。不久之后，周边终于安静了下来。
Let's cut the act now. Where's my wife?
I knew you were gonna say that. I read it all before. You're a hell of a writer. Congratulations. You're gonna bring about something glorious and terrible once we get you some proper editorial control.
What the hell are you talking about? Where's Alice?
I want the entire manuscript, or she's gonna suffer bad.
You touch her up.
随着本莫特的逃走，阿兰内心愤怒不已。他准备先逃下山，途中遭遇了极为强大的伐木工傀儡的追杀。不久后，接到了巴里的电话，原来巴里那边也被黑暗力量攻击了。阿兰急忙赶回游客中心，找到了一辆车，驱车赶回木屋。下车后，又接到了绑匪本莫特的电话，对方号称如果想见到爱丽丝，必须在2天之内写完余下的手稿内容，并在9月11日前往静峰所在的煤矿与自己见面。阿兰只得再次答应。此时，巴黎所在的木屋已经被黑暗乌鸦团团的包围。阿兰利用核能手电筒开始驱散它们。稍后，终于与巴里再次相逢。次日清晨，阿兰让巴里回到小镇中心去打听和绑架者特征相似的人，自己则留在木屋中，准备撰写手稿余下的内容。只见那纸张如同发出了刺眼的光芒，此刻他依然难以创作。不久之后，巴里突然接到女招待罗斯的电话。
Barry Wheeler speaking.
This is Rose.
Rose?
I found Mr. Mr. Wake's pages.
Oh, you sweet, brilliant girl.
Could you and Mr. Wake come get them? I live in the trailer park outside the town.
We'll be there in less than an hour.
I know.
See you soon.
Have a great day. Hope you come back soon. Welcome to the Oh Dear
Diner. Good girl.
9月10日上午，阿兰和巴里来到罗斯所租住的拖车公园。一个名叫保罗·兰多夫的男人经营着这里。
Listen, I found out all sorts of interesting stuff while I was digging around.
Yeah.
Mr. Wake, it's Sheriff Breaker. We have an FBI agent here, Agent Nightingale.
FBI?
He's anxious to see you. You'd better come to the station.
Okay, I'll be right over, Sheriff. Let's make this quick, huh?
保罗得知两个人的目的之后，同意带他们前往罗斯所在的拖车。途中，巴里提到自己今天在翻阅报纸的时候，发现了很多亮铺镇的传说，比如1970年的地震导致诗人托马斯·赞恩和钱瑞安小岛双双沉入湖底，并且还提到了他当时的缪斯，也就是当年亮铺镇本地颇有名气的芭芭拉·贾戈尔。很快，阿兰来到罗斯的拖车前，只见罗斯全身发黑，他空洞地告诉阿兰自己捡到了手稿。
I'm so glad you're here.
Hey, this is really good.
Rose.
Yes.
My manuscript. I really need it.
I understand. I know what you need. A muse to inspire you.
Oh, for Barry. She doesn't have anything.
Yeah, hey, Al. Al, what's... Oh.
Barry! What?
阿兰·维克意识到罗斯给咖啡里下了药，随着药物的效果，阿兰自己也晕了过去。
It's coming for you, hiding in my barber's skin. I'm too weak to stop it. You must turn the lights on.
I promised I'd come visit you and your lovely wife. You must finish what you started. I insist.
You must turn the lights on. Turn the light on.
Back to work, boy.
当阿兰醒来的时候，发现自己正在罗斯的卧室中，这里摆满了自己的照片和小说，简直就是大型私生饭现场。此时，巴里还在昏迷中，罗斯则坐在地上，神情呆滞，不断地念叨着什么。阿兰认为他一定是被黑暗力量影响了。这时，他隐约听到了警笛声。走出拖车之后，他得知公园经理保罗·兰多夫怕两个人对罗斯图谋不轨，于是报了警。
God knows what you've done to that poor girl.
This is Agent Nightingale, FBI! Get him up, Hemingway! You're under arrest! You move a muscle, I'll unload right in your goddamn face! Stay right where you are, Spillane!
What are? I'm standing right here, you goddamn maniac!
阿兰深知自己明天还有旅行约定，所以独自冒险逃离。他在山腰之上躲避着警方的多方位堵截。不久后，似乎警方也被黑暗力量攻击了。阿兰眼睁睁看着警方的直升机被乌鸦袭击，不久后坠毁在远方。过了一阵子，阿兰路过了小镇电台所在的地方，见到了主持人帕特缅因。对方以为阿兰终于同意前来做嘉宾了，正要准备欢迎，没想到警方再次赶到。
Whoa, everyone calm down. Put the gun down. We're all friends here, right?
Cool your jets, Nightingale. We got him. What the hell's the matter with you? There's a civilian in there.
阿兰侥幸逃脱，跑到了铁路大桥附近。 夜晚已经成为了黑暗的乐园，一切能操纵的事物都成为了黑暗的工具。在找到了一辆车之后，阿兰驾车逃离。9月11日的上午，阿兰驾车抵达了静峰的脚下，准备在中午抵达约定的地点。阿兰驱车翻山越岭，抵达了100余年前亮浦镇建镇初期的矿山区域。此地在1970年之后已经荒废。为了防止被发现，阿兰找到了一片相对安全的区域，等待和本莫特约定时间的到来。但直到夜幕降临，对方也未出现。不久后，本莫特打来电话，据称新的约定地点改到了附近的静峰观景台。阿兰被放鸽子的事情激怒了，他立刻动身前往。黑暗力量控制着废弃的物体攻击阿兰，阿兰被迫进入了银矿矿场，在里边通过吊桥勉强地爬到了最高处。在午夜爬到了静峰顶端的时候，他注意到了一所废弃的房屋，似乎是韦弗家族的宅邸。只见这里到处都被新霞韦弗涂抹了光敏材料，且几乎全部都是对托马斯·赞恩表达爱慕的字迹。在前往观景台的途中，阿兰听到了本莫特不断咆哮的声音。不知何时，阿兰听到了熟悉的声音。
Baby, it was just a nightmare.
Alice. There you go, Alan. Hartman, I fell. I had to give you a sedative. Don't fight it. You went through another rough period. What? Right now, it's very important that you stay calm. We don't want you to have another episode. You're a patient at my clinic. Have been for a while now. The shock of your wife's death triggered a mental illness. No, you're lying. You're suffering from various symptoms of undifferentiated schizophrenia.
Bastard. It's okay, Alan. Just let go.
醒来的时候，他已经在巨腐湖上方的疗养中心了。只见房间中也放着一台打字机。此时，哈特曼博士赶来了。他告诉阿兰自己看到了求救信号，于是立刻派人将他救起。哈特曼建议阿兰接下来在这里安心的疗养，且称爱丽丝已经溺水身亡了。之前的一切不过是阿兰自己崩溃后的臆想，但阿兰无论如何也不愿意相信。哈特曼带他来到外边欣赏风景，巨腐湖就在下方。阿兰假装配合他，实际上在思考对策。突然天色阴沉下来，暴风雨即将来临。哈特曼带着阿兰来到楼上，在这里，一个疯疯癫癫的游戏制作人正在抽风，一位前芭蕾舞演员也在抽风。摇滚双星安德森兄弟貌似已经被哈特曼的药物给整废了。
I'd like to bash his head in with a hammer.
Oh, he'd love to fish out our secrets, but he has no clue. He's not crazy enough. Not crazy like us, Sonny. Yeah! Being crazy's a requirement, Sonny. Who else could understand the world when it's like this? It takes crazy to know crazy.
That's the sanest thing I've heard in a while.
Say, you're all right, Tom. Hey, we like him, don't we, bro? He's got to go to the farm.
The Anderson farm. Valhalla!
We wrote it all down, less best way to forget. A crash course. All you need to know to get your head right. You need to find the message.
Here, Sonny, here's something for you. Gave me a rash, but I kept it safe from these bastards.
拿到原稿后的阿兰在思考如何逃离的时候，突然听到了巨大的响声。
Hey, Wake, you stay here. I'm gonna go see what's up. You just keep doing what you're doing. Be cool, okay?
下楼之后，阿兰发现女护工已经被安德森兄弟打晕，随即他偷偷拿到了哈特曼办公室的备用钥匙。在调查的时候，他确信哈特曼在利用这些受伤的艺术家的作品来控制黑暗力量，这里的一切都是阴谋。不久后，竟在一个房间中发现了巴里。巴里非常好奇他昨天到现在究竟去哪儿了，但阿兰没有时间解释，只想尽快找到余下的手稿。果然，哈特曼得到了他们。
Alan, please. You're sliding back into the...
Tell me one more lie and I'll shoot you in the face.
Ah, well, it was worth a shot. Really, Wake, come on. Let's work together on this. You have no idea...
Hartman, shut up! Barry, get out of here. I'll catch up with you. Get a car.
Oh, Al, let's just...
Go!
Wake, listen to me. This is a mistake. Don't you see? Together we can create something absolutely wonderful. With your ability and mine. 阿兰借助黑暗力量的影响，逃离了治疗中心。此时，巴里正在铁门的另一边接应，他给了阿兰核能手电筒。阿兰开始穿越附近的迷宫花园，绕了许久，与巴里再次于另一侧会合。昔日的巨斧湖旅馆已经彻底被毁，巴里和阿兰驾车逃离。
It's using my manuscript to take over everything.
Al, I believe you.
It happened to Thomas Zane before, it happened to the Andersons.
I believe you. Crazy or not, you're not delusional. Weird shit's going down. That's a fact. I'm on board, man. I'm with you.
The Andersons knew about it, but they were too far gone to tell me with all the drugs they were on. But they wrote it down. There's a message somewhere at their farm, Barry. You just need to find it. Look out!
Damn it, Al, talk to me!
幸亏巴里的举动，阿兰侥幸生还，且巴里本人也奇迹一般的活了下来。山下的巴里准备和阿兰在安德森农场会合。阿兰独自向农场进发，途中在搜查木屋的时候，听到了一阵惨叫。没想到几天前被关在监狱中的斯奈德，此时已经身负重伤。他身为安德森农场的看守人，长期沉迷于安德森兄弟用湖水酿造的月光酒。没想到刚蹲局子回来，就被变成了黑暗傀儡的昔日好友攻击，不久后便死了。阿兰驾驶着斯奈德的汽车向农场驶去，途中被重重障碍阻拦。浪费了一定时间，终于抵达了安德森兄弟30多年前搭建的摇滚舞台附近。只见巴里大喊出现。于是两个人将计就计，在摇滚乐和舞台灯火的帮助之下，抵抗着附近源源不断的黑暗傀儡。经过许久的战斗，才抵达了安德森兄弟的家中。俩老头之前告诉阿兰，自己当年的音乐中藏有一定信息，于是他和巴里启动了电力，开始播放阿斯加德古神乐队的单曲《诗人和缪斯》。歌词中，辛西娅·韦弗被称为“光之女神”。于是阿兰决定明天就去他所在的发电厂。
Okay.
We need to find Cynthia Weaver. We'll stay here for the night and head back to town as soon as it gets light.
Hey, Al. Lots of hours before dawn. Might as well get some rest. And by rest, I mean drunk.
Come on, Barry, this is... Yeah, what the hell?
他和巴里开始畅饮起了安德森兄弟酿造的酒水。
Find her, right? Even though you're a crazy bastard, I'm gonna stick by you, no matter what, ever, Al. Sure, like a brother.
I'm a writer, goddammit.
Correct.
If I just wanted to, I could write 10 books a year. And they'd be the best books that year.
No, you couldn't.
That's right, I couldn't. But I could, because I'm a writer.
What? What do they put in this stuff? I feel like my brain is coming out of my nose. I'm gonna get the recipe off those coots and be a booze millionaire.
I just miss her, Barry. I just want her here with me.
I know, Al. I know. It's gonna be okay. We're gonna make it okay.
就在两个人醉倒之后，阿兰想起了自己在坠入巨斧湖后1周内发生的事情。可不知如何，南丁格尔探员再次找到了自己。
That's right, James Joyce. It's your fault, and you're gonna pay for it.
9月13日，阿兰和巴里一同被关进了监狱中。电台里，帕特缅因正在谈论第68届驯鹿节的事情，而辛夏韦弗的身影突然出现在监狱中。
Someone will come for it when the time is right. Thomas said so. He wrote it. The key is insurance. It's my job to keep it safe. Safe in the light. Always in the light. Hello.
傍晚，两个人终于醒来。阿兰得知自己的手稿已经被南丁格尔口留，对方似乎得知了手稿可以在小镇范围内改变现实的事情。不久后，南丁格尔探员和莎拉警长一同赶来。显然，莎拉警长对于阿兰的事情存在着不同的看法。
Wake, what's wrong?
Lady, are you stupid? It's a trick. It's an obvious trick.
Okay, I've had enough of this crap. Wake, I'm gonna trust you with this.
You're joking.
Agent Nightingale, your opinion would matter more if you were sober and if I actually believed you were here on official business.
Whoa! Get back in the cell, Stephen King. The only way you're leaving this place is over my dead.
可这时，他突然反应过来，自己此时的举动似乎和手稿中描述的桥段一模一样。 随着黑暗力量的袭来，莎拉、阿兰和巴里只得一同行动。莎拉决定让巴里先留在警局中，自己和阿兰一同去市政厅寻找直升飞机的钥匙，以便抵达发电厂。于是，阿兰和莎拉开始在街道上与傀儡们展开拉锯战。莎拉的父亲弗兰克是阿兰忠实的书迷，以至于莎拉本人对于阿兰·维克的印象还算不错。抵达市政厅之后，阿兰找到了钥匙，刚一出来就发现巴里竟然跑了出来。
Barry?
Why isn't he inside?
Oh God! Oh God!
Barry, look out! Barry, move! Barry!
He made it inside, Wake. He's okay.
随即，两个人准备去直升机所在的地方，途经了1878年。 为小镇奠定基础的比尔特·莫尔和甘德森的雕像，两个人来到小镇的书店前，要求住在2层的医生打开店门。助理医生此时被外边发生的事情吓懵逼了，过了半天才反应过来。终于，两个人穿过了书店，准备再穿过教堂。两个人不得不进入了教堂漆黑的地下。就在即将出去的时候，强大的敌人堵在了门口。此时，一发信号弹发射过来。 将傀儡完全消灭。原来巴里本人已经提前赶到，只见他全身缠绕着为驯鹿节准备的灯串，以充当保护罩。三个人一同行动，终于抵达了直升机停靠的地方。由于黑暗力量过于强大，阿兰独自对抗了许久。此时，直升机终于可以稳定起飞。
Barry,
big chance on a local crazy lady, Al. I hope you're right about her, or we can kiss this town goodbye.
I hope you know how to deal with this, Wake. I guess you New Yorkers are used to rough situations like this.
Right, the city's a war zone. King Kong, mutant alligators, and Alex Casey shoots the place up every weekend. Look, I never even carried a gun until a couple of days ago.
Well, my dad used to be a cop there. Tells some pretty wild stories.
Stuff like this?
No, just normal bad stuff. Kinda like your books, Wake. I used to tease Dad that he was just like Alex Casey.
You've read me.
Oh, sure. You're a pretty good writer. A little heavy on the metaphors, maybe.
Nobody's ever said that before.
We're coming up on the power plant. See the lit building over there? And that's the dam further up the river. I can't land here. I'll take her down the road across the river.
Just get me there, Sheriff.
阿兰坠落之后，帮助直升机消灭了黑暗的乌鸦。随后，他只得独自前往发电厂。他发现想要去对岸，必须要启动大桥。然而，仅靠自己，这座大桥是不会停下来的。终于，阿兰及时抵达了对岸。莎拉驾驶着直升机帮助阿兰避开黑暗。就这样，阿兰终于先一步抵达了发电厂。
Miss Weaver, Cynthia, I'm a friend.
Prove it.
You knew Zane, Thomas Zane. You're the Lady of the Light in the song. You can help me.
About time. Young man, I've been waiting a very long time for you.
新夏告诉他，电厂的变压器已经被破坏，几乎耗尽了储备电力，所以必须要先切断发电厂院子里电源。阿兰只得再次回去，冒险关闭了变压器。 再次回来的时候，新夏决定带领他从地道前往安全屋，那里似乎已经被他打造成了避难所。途中，他把自己和托马斯·赞恩的故事告诉了阿兰。这部分内容我在上期视频里边讲过了。阿兰得知新夏和托马斯达成了约定，他建造了安全屋，且保留了托马斯·赞恩在撰写阿兰·维克的故事时凭空创造的神奇开关。新夏本人也知道，阿兰同样被黑暗力量威胁着，写出了一个类似的手稿故事。这个故事还没有写完。 如果阿兰·维克失败了，黑暗力量一定会完全的控制他，写出一个颠倒性的结局，导致彻底控制现实世界。就在准备进入管道的时候，巴黎打来电话，不过似乎他们遭遇了意外。阿兰放心不下自己的朋友，决定出去帮助他们。尽管新夏并不希望他半途而废，但阿兰更在意朋友的安危。
Well, be a fool. I'll use the pipe. I'll meet you at the dam if you make it.
很快，阿兰来到了外边，爬上了山坡，发现直升机残骸附近并没有巴里和莎拉。不久后，终于听到了他们的声音，三个人再次会合，一边战斗一边往水坝的方向走。途中，阿兰为两个人开启电控门之后，被障碍物堵在了外边，再次落单。黑暗力量已经强大到足以摧毁大型建筑群。阿兰·维克独自躲避着障碍，向大坝尽头跑去。 终于和其他三个人在电梯处相会。在新夏的带领下，一行人抵达了安全屋。
Take it, and I won't need to worry about the room anymore because Section 33 and 118 need changing soon, and I don't want to climb up the ladder to change them because it's very late and I'm tired. And if you take it, I won't have to do that anymore.
The page was autobiographical, a memory from my childhood. But I didn't write this. It was a page written by Thomas Zane. None of them were supposed to exist anymore.
Alan, 7 years old, would fight sleep to the bitter end. When he did sleep, he soon woke up, screaming, the nightmares fresh in his mind. One evening, his mother, sitting by his bed, offered him an old light switch. She called it the clicker, and flicking the switch would turn on a magical light that would drive the beast away.
To imbue the talisman with all possible power, she added that it had been given to her by Alan's father. Alan never knew him, and anything of his took on mythical proportions in his mind. With the clicker firmly in his hand, Alan finally slept like a baby. Now, almost 30 years later, Alan thought of this as he stood on the rim of Cauldron Lake, the clicker in his hand. He took a deep breath and jumped.
My mind swirled. I'd given the clicker to Alice, yet it was here. Zane had written it into existence in a story I had written. I can get to her now. I can finish this.
阿兰并不愿意放弃拯救爱丽丝，他希望利用神奇开关，顺用托马斯·赞恩遗作中描绘的方式，彻底击退黑暗力量。
I'm going back to the lake to finish this. I'm going to write an ending to the story in the manuscript on my own terms, to make it all right.
Why can't you just write it here?
The last page is still in the typewriter. I need to read it first. Everything needs to be just right. Zane tried to cut some corners, and it didn't end well.
Okay, ready when you are.
I'm sorry, Sarah, but I need to do this alone. Barry, take her gun. Miss Weaver, close the door when I leave.
Good luck, Al.
See you later.
清晨，阿伦·维克驱车向另一方的巨斧湖驶去。驶入隧道时，黑暗力量已经强大到瞬间扭转了天色。夜晚突然降临，阿兰面对重重的阻碍，准备穿越大半个小镇回到老地方。就在爬到巨斧湖上方的时候，他利用信号枪对抗黑暗龙卷风。成功之后，他握着神奇开关，再次坠入了湖中。这一次，他似乎又回到黑暗领域中的某处。黑暗力量伪造了纽约中的公寓，甚至伪造了爱丽丝本人。
Baby, you were having a bad dream. It was just another nightmare.
No.
Everything's fine. You're home.
It wasn't a dream.
Everything's fine.
Turn the lights on. Turn the lights on.
一切都在考验着阿兰的意志。他终于在光明力量的提示下，重新获得了神奇开关，进入了一个更为奇异的空间中。
You must find your way to the cabin. It stands in your way. It won't let you pass. It has no heart. It's filled with darkness. You must fill its heart with light.
托马斯·赞恩为了让阿兰安心对抗黑暗，用他大部分的力量在现实中创造了另一个阿兰·维克。这个人被称为空壳先生。这个假的阿兰·维克将在后续的日子里代替他在现实中的位置。
Use the clicker.
Now you will never get her back. I am much older than you. Older than your first work of art. I will find a new face to wear. Someone else to dream me free.
I could feel Alice's presence close by. I understood what I had to do now. I knew how to write the ending to Departure. There's light and there's darkness. Cause and effect. There's guilt and there's atonement. But the scales always need to balance. Everything has a price. That's where Zane had gone wrong. There's a long journey through the night back into the light.
Alice? Alice? Oh no!
最终，爱丽丝活着回到了岸上。9月15日，驯鹿节正式开始举行。亮铺镇似乎摆脱了黑暗的日子。不远处传来了摇滚变色龙大卫鲍伊的经典歌曲《太空怪客》。小镇中人们欢声笑语。对自己自责不已的罗斯手中抱着一盏灯，防备着黑暗，而他身后似乎出现了新的黑暗化身——南丁格尔探员。阿伦·维克此时身在黑暗的领域中，继续创作余下的手稿。不知过了多久，阿伦·维克只觉得自己仿佛回到了一个似曾相识的地方，但一切又不尽相同。太阳以不自然的方式升上了天空。
I knew this place. It was familiar, but wrong somehow.
Welcome to the
Everything had a surreal, dreamlike quality.
餐厅中，熟悉的人们身上散发着一种不真实的气息，他们说的话也有些失真。每个人都站在老地方，但黑暗中却没有了芭芭拉·贾格尔。不久后，托马斯·赞恩的声音再次出现。
Alan, listen to me. Go no deeper.
What?
Focus. You're losing yourself. I will try to help the best I can, but it's up to you. Find a better point of contact.
镜子里有一个发疯的人。阿兰反应过来，镜子中的竟然是发疯的自己。
Suddenly, Wake found himself face to face with himself.
托马斯再次凭空给了阿兰手电筒和手枪。
I knew it was my writing, but the words were jumbled to dreamlike fragments. Reloading frantically. The rounds slippery stones throw away from the tent. The bed looked inviting, but it was just the radio. I had to go on. She was startled by the phone.
光明力量用文字的形式再次出现于阿兰的面前，这一次甚至还有一部特殊的手机，它是一部 GPS。
The GPS system was working. I hadn't expected that.
他不知道的是，此刻自己正陷落在噩梦和混乱的自我意识，在脑海的想象力中，黑暗突破了前所未有的障碍。毫无逻辑的危险遍布在四周，记忆也不再可靠。阿兰·维克唯一的希望就是跟随着 GPS 指引的方向，试着寻找到出路。巴里的幽灵也出现了，他甚至还知道此刻的自己是阿兰脑海中的幻想。在阿兰混乱的意识中，出现了一些极其险恶的场景：会喷火的地下室，自己撰写书籍变成了乌鸦。发疯的汽车，以及鬼畜的电视和他们的帮凶，似乎他已经离清醒越来越远。这个时候，看牙一次就想打牙一次的哈特曼博士又出现了。
There you go, Alan. Hartman. It's all in your head. You've been making it up. Really, Wade. Really, Wade. Come on. Your delusions.
Why is this happening to me? But no, Hartman. There's no way out. No way out. No way out. I need to get out of here. Get out. No. How do I get out of here?
Really, Wade. Really. Your delusions are out of control.
Get out of my head.
Seriously, Al, you need to get a grip. You know reality's different here. See what I mean, Al?
阿兰开始意识到自己再不回头就来不及了。巴里依然如同幽灵一样不断的出现，阿兰只得寄托于托马斯·赞恩的帮助。
You have done well, Alan. Now I can accompany you. You are trapped in your own dream. You must wake yourself up, but first you have to reach yourself.
The cabin.
Yes, my cabin. It will not be easy. Your previous work can help you. I still have some pages of your manuscript left. Words like that have power here.
托马斯又提到那个名叫华痕先生，亦或者空壳先生的人，但阿兰并不知道那个所谓的替代者是正是邪。阿兰有着更迫在眉睫的麻烦，此时他可以说是在想象力中游走，可以依靠反重力的物品凭空创造道路。但是这些事物也可以反过来要他的命。在一个巨大的反转空间中，阿兰看到了曾经在亮铺镇中见过的那些人。这一次，他真的要抵达那座想象中的灯塔了，只不过他在一个遥不可及的地方。阿兰通过断壁残垣来到一个房间内，只见自己变成了电视机的样子，正在被开牙一次想打牙一次的哈特曼治疗。
You refused my offer of help, and here you are. Did being so obdurate really get you to a better place?
No.
No. And did it really help Alice? Was this really the best thing for your wife?
Probably not.
You know, I've been talking with her. There's something she wanted you to hear.
Oh, hey. That sounds like fun.
All I ever wanted was to help you, Alan. I ate all the shit you handed out and tried to understand your pathetic, wealthy white male drama until my life consisted of managing your never-ending crisis. I hate you for your childish temper and the arrogance and self-indulgent pride that undermine all efforts to drag.
阿兰并不相信爱丽丝会说出这样的话。在人的想象中，一个随意的念头就可以摧毁一个坚固的人设。
Yes, you do. I know how it goes. You're a complete failure. I hate
hate you and I'll never forgive you for whatever it was that you did. Am I wrong?
冒着危险，阿兰来到了飘在空中的山体之上。此时，黑暗已经完全吞噬了一切，只有灯塔的灯光在转动。此刻，他已经成了唯一的希望。不知过了多久，阿兰终于进入了灯塔，但一切似乎并没有结束。此时，他要面对心魔的挑战，那些熟悉的人即将变成噩梦一样的敌人。
Go! I'm earning the 50% commission. Let's crack that writer's block of yours, Alan! Hell, it's great to work close. It's just making sure you don't
接连消灭黑暗化的哈特曼和安德森兄弟之后，阿兰的挚友巴里也开始对他重拳出击。 并且每次被消灭都会变得更离谱。最终，阿兰击退了想象中的巴里。他的意识重新回到黑暗空间的木屋中。
It's too dark. Where am I? I can't find my way. Why is this happening to me? I can't find my way. It's too dark. Why is this happening to me?
Just like that, my mind was clear. Zane had been right. I could think clearly again. But I couldn't survive in this place the way he had, and I might not make it back a second time. Leaving this place would be hard. Maybe impossible. It wouldn't take much for my thoughts to stray again. It was too easy to get lost in the dark place. Before, I was ready to curl up and die. Let myself slip away. But here I was. The yet unwritten future waiting to unfold before me. A sequel to Departure. My name is Alan Wake, and I'm a writer.
阿兰·维克的命运究竟会如何呢？在他不在的日子里，一个黑暗的存在以他的样貌出现在了现实中，并且做出了一系列不可思议的事情。OK， 心灵杀手的故事到此结束。你们的老灵魂博伟君，心灵杀手美国噩梦。过一阵子咱们游戏毒品回见。